Somewhere on a small plastic card in your wallet or on a sticker inside a hospital file, there might be two characters that most people glance at once and never think about again. O positive, it looks like nothing, a letter and a symbol. But that little label is sitting on top of one of the strangest and oldest stories biology has ever managed to preserve. It is a story about ancient sickness, frozen rivers, ocean crossings, and small advantages that added up over tens of thousands of years until they became the most common blood type on the entire planet. Today we are going to pull that story apart, piece by piece, and see what your blood has actually been carrying this whole time. Let's start with something that surprises a lot of people. Blood type was not always seen as interesting. For most of the last century, doctors treated it as a purely practical detail. You needed to know it before a transfusion, before surgery, before childbirth, and that was basically the end of the conversation. Nobody was writing books about the ancient meaning of blood type, because nobody thought there was one. It took genetics catching up to biology before scientists realized that this simple medical label was actually a window into deep human history. The discovery itself goes back to 1901, when a scientist working in Vienna started mixing blood samples from different people in his lab. Some samples blended together smoothly. Others clumped up almost instantly, like milk curdling. At first, this looked like a strange lab accident, but he kept testing, and a pattern kept showing up. Human blood, it turned out, was not one single substance. It came in different types, and mixing the wrong types together could be dangerous or even fatal. That discovery eventually gave us the system we still use today: A, B, AB, and O. For a long time after that, most researchers assumed type A was probably the original human blood type, mostly because it showed up so often in European populations. And European populations were the ones being studied the most. It seemed dominant, it seemed common, so it was easy to assume it came first. This turned out to be a classic case of a small sample size creating a big wrong idea. Once genetic testing spread out across the world and scientists finally had a fuller picture, the assumption fell apart. Here is the biology in plain terms. Blood type is controlled by one gene sitting on chromosome 9. That gene's job is to tell the body how to build tiny sugar structures called antigens on the surface of red blood cells. If you have a working copy of the A version, your cells get A antigens. If you have a working copy of the B version, your cells get B antigens. If you have both, you get AB. Type O happens when the gene is essentially broken, unable to produce either sugar marker. So in a strange way, O isn't really a type being built. It's the absence of the other two. Nothing is being added. Something is simply missing, and that missing piece turned out to matter more than anyone expected. When researchers began mapping blood types across the globe, real geographic patterns started to appear. Western Europe leans heavily toward type A. Parts of northern India show unusually high rates of type B. Sub-Saharan Africa shows a fairly even mix across several types. But then there are populations, especially indigenous groups across the Americas before European contact, where type O shows up at levels that are honestly hard to believe. In some communities, researchers found blood type O in nearly the entire population. Not most people. Almost everyone. That is not something you get from random chance. In genetics, when one version of a trait appears in almost every single member of a population, it usually means that population descended from a small founding group. If most of your ancestors carried a particular gene, it spreads through every branch of the family tree that follows, generation after generation, until it saturates the entire group. So the extremely high rate of type O in early American populations wasn't an accident. It was a fingerprint left behind by a small number of original ancestors who happened to carry that gene, multiplied across thousands of years. Now here is where the trail heads toward Asia. Every major line of evidence about the peopling of the Americas, skeletal remains, ancient tools, and especially DNA, points to a slow, patient migration route out of northern and eastern Asia. This is often discussed under a theory researchers call the Beringian standstill. The rough idea is that a group of people crossed into the region connecting Siberia and Alaska. And instead of moving straight through, they may have stayed there for a long stretch of time, isolated from other populations, before eventually spreading south into the Americas. Whatever their exact timeline looked like, the genetic evidence lines up clearly with an Asian origin. If you look at blood type distribution across modern Asia today, you find type O is common in many regions, though not uniformly. In the Philippines, for example, roughly 45% of the population carries type O. In Vietnam, it sits close to 42%. India shows a more complicated picture, with type B rising sharply in the north, while type O still holds a strong presence throughout the country. None of this means all of Asia is one uniform genetic block. Asia is enormous and incredibly diverse. But it does mean the continent holds a massive reservoir of the type O gene, and that reservoir is very likely the deep source many global O populations eventually trace back to. Genetic researchers didn't stop at simply counting blood types by region. They went further and actually compared the specific mutations responsible for shutting off the gene in different populations. This matters because there isn't just one single way to end up with type O. There are several different mutations that can break the gene, and each one leaves a slightly different genetic signature, almost like a manufacturing stamp. When scientists studied the version most common in East Asian populations, sometimes labeled O1 or O2 in research papers, they found small surrounding genetic markers that let them trace its age and its movement across time. Following that trail consistently led back deep into the history of the Asian continent. There's also a stranger layer buried in the DNA of many Asian and Asian-descended populations, and it has nothing to do with blood type directly, but it belongs in this story. When early modern humans expanded out of Africa and moved through Asia tens of thousands of years ago, they were not moving into empty land. Other early human groups had already been living there for a very long time. Modern genetic studies have confirmed that these groups interbred, and traces of that ancient mixing still show up in the DNA of people alive today, particularly in parts of Asia, and in populations descended from Asia. It's a reminder that the human story was never one clean line. It was overlapping, branching, and mixing long before written history existed. So why did type O manage to spread so widely and survive so successfully across so many different populations in thousands of years? The leading explanation researchers keep returning to is disease. For almost all of human history, the biggest threat to survival wasn't war or predators. It was infection. Plagues, parasites, and bacteria killed far more people than almost anything else, and it turns out blood type actually has a measurable relationship with how the immune system responds to certain diseases. Some studies suggest type O carriers may have a somewhat different risk profile when it comes to certain strains of malaria, and researchers have also looked at possible links between blood type and the severity of some viral infections, including more recent research involving coronaviruses. None of this means type O acts like a shield. It doesn't. But across hundreds of thousands of years, even a small survival edge, something like a 1 or 2% better chance of surviving childhood during an outbreak, is enough to reshape an entire population's genetics over time. Small advantages, repeated across thousands of generations, eventually become dominant patterns. But nothing in biology comes free, and type O has its own costs. Research has connected type O blood with a higher likelihood of developing stomach ulcers, largely tied to a bacterium called H. pylori, which appears to thrive more easily in the digestive environment of people with this blood type. There's also documented research linking type O, combined with H. pylori infection, to elevated rates of stomach cancer in some East Asian populations. It's one of those open questions researchers are still trying to untangle. Why would the same blood type that may have offered a survival edge against certain ancient diseases end up creating vulnerability to a completely different modern health issue? That kind of trade-off shows up constantly in genetics. Nature rarely hands out pure advantages. It hands out compromises. There's also a rare and genuinely strange condition worth mentioning here, called the Bombay phenotype. It was first identified in 1952 in the city then known as Bombay, now Mumbai. People with this condition test as type O using standard blood tests, but they are not actually type O in the genetic sense. Normal blood typing relies on detecting a foundational sugar structure called the H antigen, which sits underneath the A and B markers. People with the Bombay phenotype are missing that foundational structure entirely, so even if their genes would otherwise allow them to build A or B antigens, they simply can't, because the base layer isn't there. This means they cannot safely receive blood from regular type O donors, only from other people who share the same rare condition. It's most commonly documented in parts of the Indian subcontinent, appearing in roughly 1 out of every 10,000 people there, while globally it's closer to 1 in a million. It's a small but powerful reminder that even a category as familiar as type O hides more genetic complexity underneath the surface than a basic blood test can ever show. Stepping back, when you put all of these pieces together, the global map of type O positive starts to look less like a medical statistic and more like a historical record. It traces a path from ancient populations in Asia, across the frozen land bridge into the Americas, out across the islands of the Pacific, and back through the vast steppes connecting Central Asia to the edges of Europe. And thanks to modern ancient DNA research, this picture keeps getting sharper. In the last 15 years or so, scientists have managed to extract usable genetic material from human remains that are thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years old. Ice Age hunters, early farmers, ancient traders, all of them have left behind genetic material that researchers can now actually read. What they've found is consistent. Type O appears to have already been widespread across East Asia at least 30,000 years ago. Ancient populations connected to the early ancestors of Native Americans appear to have carried even higher rates of type O than many of their modern descendants do today. Early farming communities in what is now China show blood type patterns that closely resemble those still found in southern Chinese populations today. Piece by piece, ancient DNA keeps confirming what researchers had already suspected from studying living populations. The deep roots of type O run far back into Asian prehistory. There's another migration story tied into this, one that's easy to overlook because it happened across open ocean rather than open land. Roughly 5,000 years ago, seafaring groups originating from the area now known as Taiwan began a long, slow expansion across the Pacific. Over the following centuries, they settled island after island, eventually reaching territories thousands of miles apart. When researchers study the genetics of Pacific Islander populations today, they consistently find elevated rates of type O, patterns that echo what shows up in indigenous populations of the Americas as well. Two population groups, separated by the largest ocean on the planet, both carrying strong traces of the same ancient blood signature. The ocean didn't erase that inheritance, it just carried it in two different directions. Some questions in this field still don't have clean answers. Why is type B so unusually common in northern India compared to almost anywhere else on Earth? Some researchers suspect it connects back to ancient migrations coming out of Central Asia, where type B may have first become common, while others think it reflects a more local origin or a regional survival advantage that hasn't been fully identified yet. Why does type A tend to show up slightly more often in East Asian populations compared to European ones, even though A is generally considered the rarer type overall? Part of the explanation may simply be mathematical. In populations where type B is already common, there's a higher statistical chance of producing AB offspring, which shifts the surrounding numbers. And why do certain isolated communities, like some indigenous groups in Taiwan and parts of the Philippines, still show blood type patterns that closely resemble ancient Asian populations from thousands of years ago? The most likely explanation is geography itself. Populations that remained relatively isolated experienced far less genetic mixing than mainland regions, which absorbed wave after wave of migration, invasion, and trade over the centuries. Isolation, in this case, acted almost like a time capsule. Genetics researchers have also cross-referenced blood type data with two other ancient genetic threads, the Y chromosome, which passes almost unchanged from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to daughter. East Asian populations frequently carry specific Y chromosome lineages linked to ancestors who lived tens of thousands of years ago. And on the maternal side, East Asian populations often carry distinct mitochondrial lineages with equally deep roots in the region. When researchers line these patterns up against blood type data, they consistently find overlap. Populations carrying the oldest, most ancestral Asian paternal and maternal lineages also tend to be the populations with the oldest and most stable type O frequencies. Three completely separate genetic threads, and they keep pointing toward the same general place. There's something almost quietly emotional about all of this, if you sit with it for a moment. Blood type isn't something you choose or earn. It was decided for you the instant you were conceived, handed down by ancestors you will never meet, who received it from their own ancestors before them, stretching back along an unbroken chain that goes further than any family tree could ever record on paper. Knowing that your type O positive blood likely traces back to ancient Asia isn't just a fact about chemistry sitting in a lab report. It's a fragment of inherited history, quietly carried inside every red blood cell in your body, shaped by decisions your ancestors never consciously made, but that their bodies made for them through survival. Modern medicine keeps finding new connections tied to blood type as well. Some research suggests type O carriers may have slightly lower rates of certain cardiovascular issues related to blood clotting tied to naturally thinner blood, though that same trait can mean slightly higher risk when it comes to serious bleeding after an injury. There's also research pointing toward differences in how mosquitoes are drawn to people based on blood type, which carries real practical relevance in regions where mosquito-borne illness is a serious concern. None of this paints a complete picture yet. Researchers are still filling in the gaps, and new studies are being published regularly. If you zoom out and look at the full map, with all its regional differences and unanswered questions, a pattern still holds. Overlay the global spread of type O against the historical map of major epidemics throughout human history, and you start to see connections. Regions that endured certain waves of disease often show distinct shifts in blood type frequency in the generations that followed. Populations that survived certain plagues carry one pattern. Populations shaped by different disease pressures carry another. In many regions across Asia and the populations that trace back to Asia, type O appears to have become common not because anyone selected it on purpose, but because, generation after generation, it offered just enough of an edge to help people survive when survival was the only thing that mattered. So what does any of this actually mean for someone today? Glancing at their own blood type on a medical chart, seeing that single letter followed by a plus sign, it doesn't mean your identity needs to change, and it doesn't mean you suddenly belong to some specific place you never knew about. What it does mean is that your blood carries a kind of memory older than any country, older than any border ever drawn on a map. It means that somewhere far back in your family's long, mostly unrecorded history, there were people who survived disease, crossed frozen land, sailed across open ocean, or endured famine, and passed a small, quiet piece of their biology all the way down to you. The science here is still evolving. Every year, researchers refine the techniques used to read ancient DNA. And every year, new connections between blood type, disease resistance, and ancient migration get published. The picture is becoming clearer, not blurrier. And what keeps becoming clear is this. Type O positive is not just a common label on a hospital form. It's one of the oldest and most quietly persistent genetic records the human body carries. A signature shaped by disease, migration, and survival, stretching back tens of thousands of years to populations who walked and eventually sailed out of Asia and slowly filled nearly every corner of the inhabited world. Your blood isn't just fluid moving through your veins. In a very real sense, it's a historical record, written in chemistry instead of language, carried forward by people who never could have imagined their descendants would one day have the tools to actually read it. That story isn't finished being told. Researchers are still decoding new pieces of it every year, but the broad outline is already clear, and it keeps pointing back toward the same deep origin, toward long migrations, toward small genetic advantages that helped certain ancestors survive one more winter, one more outbreak, one more difficult season, and toward the quiet, persistent spread of a blood type that eventually became the most common one on Earth. If you carry type O, positive blood, you're carrying a small piece of that entire history inside you right now. Not a definition of who you are, but a record of where your biology has been. And thanks to modern genetics,